Hello, welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Institute, and I'm delighted to wish everyone on this call, on this event, a happy new year. Today, we are marking the release of the first of the Washington Institute's Transition 2021 series of presidential transition memos to the new administration. Every year that we've been in existence, every presidential inaugural year since 1988. We have tried to engage with new administrations in providing advice to the new team on a broad array of Middle East issues. This has grown more complicated over the many administrations in which we've tried to do this. And this year, we're going to be producing about a dozen separate and discrete presidential transition memos. We thought it appropriate to begin our series with what may very well be the most important, most urgent item in terms of Middle East policy on the agenda of the new administration, and that concerns Iran nuclear diplomacy. I'm delighted that my colleague, Ambassador Dennis Ross, is the author of this inaugural Transition 2021 transition paper that gives new thinking to how the Biden administration can address this urgent challenge. Ambassador Ross has more than a quarter-century experience at high levels of government, working for both Democratic and Republican presidents, most recently serving as President Obama's special assistant and senior director for the Central Region on the National Security Council, with responsibility for Iran policy. Our Iran transition paper is now available on the website of the Washington Institute, but don't read it right now because we get to hear Dennis offer some insights from that paper, after which we will turn to two of the most widely respected Iran experts, respected across the political aisle, for their insights on Iranian politics and the very issues we're talking about today. I'm delighted to welcome Meghan O'Sullivan and Suzanne Maloney. Meghan is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of International Relations, of International Affairs, and Director of the Geopolitics of Energy Project at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Suzanne is the Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. And between the two of them and Dennis, I think we have outstanding critical mass for delving into this highly relevant, highly timely, highly important issue of Iranian nuclear diplomacy. So before I begin, let me just ask people who are viewing, if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to send them directly to me at rsatloff, R-S-A-T-L-O-F-F, at washingtoninstitute.org, or you can use your chat function in our webinar, and you can send your question directly to me, and I will try to filter it into our conversation. With that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dennis, and then we'll turn to our panelists and open it up for conversation. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks to both Meghan and Suzanne for being here. I'll do an overview of the paper. I think it's fair to say that attention in this city today is probably not riveted on what we're talking about right now, but come January 20th, we're going to have a President Biden administration. And what we're seeing from the Iranians right now is they're trying to force themselves onto the agenda. This is an administration whose priorities are going to be largely domestic, and when it comes to foreign policy, it'll be restoring the US as a good global citizen. It'll be dealing with China. The Middle East is not likely to be one of its top priorities. And the Iranians right now are acting in a way that's designed to say, well, you're going to have to deal with us. So they're now enriching to 20%. You might recall that Prime Minister Netanyahu in September of 2012 said, if Iran produces one bomb's worth of 20% enriched uranium, that's a red line for Israel, meaning they would act militarily if that got crossed. So that obviously makes this a dicey issue to begin with. If that wasn't enough, the Iranians also seized a South Korean tanker as well, again, showing you better deal with us because there are problems that we can create if you don't. So we know from President-elect Biden, that he laid out an approach actually during the campaign on how he would deal with Iran. The first thing he laid out, he said, was that he will be determined to prevent Iran from ever having a nuclear weapon. The second was that he would act to establish a credible pathway for diplomacy and negotiations with the Iranians, based on the principle, if the Iranians come back into compliance with the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, we would be in compliance, and the JCPOA would be a starting point for negotiations. The third was that he would preserve our leverage to be able to deal with other issues, not just ballistic missiles, not just human rights, but also Iran's regional destabilizing activities. I think most observers would look at those objectives and that broad approach as being acceptable. The critical question isn't whether it's the right set of objectives. The critical question is, can you achieve them? And one of the things I wanted to do in the paper was to say, okay, if you're going to try to achieve these kinds of objectives and you're going to have a successful policy, one place to start is by looking back at what lessons can you learn from the approaches that Obama and then Trump pursued. And then also, how can you look at how to reconcile what will be a set of conflicting pressures? So let me go through some of those lessons, those conflicting pressures, and then my suggested responses to them. Some of the lessons, and I won't go through all the assumptions that guided these two administrations, but let me sort of encapsulate them. In the case of Obama, there were a series of assumptions, one of which was that the nuclear issue was so urgent because if we couldn't deal with it and demonstrate to the Israelis that we were able to prevent the Iranians from moving towards a nuclear weapon, there was a very high probability that Israel would act militarily. And just as I start today, this again is an issue. Because of this notion of the urgency of dealing with the nuclear issue, there was a conscious decision made, we'll deal with all the other issues, whether it's ballistic missiles or it's regional behaviors, we'll deal with them later. We'll focus to start with just on dealing with the nuclear issue. So that was assumption number one. A second basic assumption was you could affect Iran's behavior. But what you would have to do to affect it was you'd have to build pressure on it. But the pressure couldn't be only economic, as important as that might be. The pressure also had to be political. You had to build a common front against Iran and you had to isolate the Iranians. And by doing that, you would create the kind of leverage that could alter what the Iranians were prepared to do. There were other assumptions, including one that the notion that the sanctions could be effective was real, but there was also perception of belief that they were not sustainable, that the international community's ability to sustain the sanctions was wearing thin, and we needed to move quickly while we still had leverage on them. And there was another assumption that in the aftermath of doing the deal, there was this belief that if we called out the Iranians on what they were doing in the region, as they began to do more, especially in Syria, but not only there, that they would seize on this as an excuse not to implement the deal. Now, some of these assumptions were clearly right. There was, and we can get in, if people want, we can get into the discussion on this. There clearly was, in 2011, 2012, an Israeli impulse to act militarily if we couldn't demonstrate that we were affecting the Iranian nuclear policy. That was a fact. A second thing that I think was right was building a common front against the Iranians, isolating them politically, not just economically, and not just acting through covert means. That was important as well. And here, these two assumptions I think were quite right. The other assumptions that I mentioned that weren't right, the notion that because other governments were opposed to sustaining the sanctions regime, that misled I think the Obama administration into believing that the sanctions weren't sustainable. And of course they were sustainable because it's not the governments who determine whether their companies and banks are going to respect or respond to possible secondary American sanctions. It's the private sector and the international financial system and the like. And so it turns out that our leverage economically was much more sustainable than I think the Obama administration believed. And also this notion that the Iranians were looking for an excuse not to implement it. If we had put pressure on them or sought sanctions for what they were doing in the region, they would have walked away from the agreement. I think we've seen their behavior actually shows that wasn't the case. We watched Iran for a year after the Trump administration walked away from the JCPOA, not walk away from the deal. It really wasn't until May 2020 that we really saw them begin to take much more dramatic steps on walking away from the JCPOA. So trying to create fissures in this coalition against them has clearly been one of the things that's driven them. Now, when you look at Trump, the Trump administration made one basic assumption, which was maximum economic pressure. Just could put that on them, and either the regime would come around and concede and meet what we felt was necessary, or it would collapse. The notion that we had to maintain a kind of coalition approach, we had to maintain a kind of broad political front against them, we had to keep them isolated politically, really was not part of this. And in addition, there was this kind of assumption, because they would either concede or collapse, that you didn't need to create an alternative to the JCPOA, and you really didn't need to anticipate what the Iranian options were and what they could do in terms of counter pressure in response. When you look at these two sets of assumptions and the lessons from the two approaches, I think what comes out is we can sustain economic leverage, but it has much more impact if it's part of a broader political approach. There is a need to take into account the concerns of local regional actors, because Iran's behavior in the region actually leads these actors to take steps on their own, particularly if they think that we won't. And so when you draw these kinds of lessons, that begins also to highlight some of what I call the conflicting pressures and objectives that the administration now faces. One first pressure, one set of conflicting pressures is there still is a value in maybe dealing with all of the Iranian issues, for sure, but you really don't want to hold hostage the ability to make nuclear progress to being able to make progress on the other issues. That was an assumption that I think many have debated in the aftermath of the Obama administration, but I would say today, again, given Iran's behavior, we're kind of reminded that that is a conflicting set of pressures you got to somehow figure out how to reconcile. A second one is the Europeans and others internationally outside of the Middle East view the JCPOA as being a kind of the appropriate place to resume diplomacy. The problem with that, and it obviously reflects some of what the president-elect has said, the problem with that is that for the Republicans and for an administration that wants to pursue bipartisanship generally, but especially in foreign policy, the Republicans see the JCPOA as a symbol on which they're almost uniformly opposed. And they will need to be convinced that somehow we can retain our leverage even if we go back into the JCPOA. So here's another pressure that has to be reconciled. A third one is with the regional countries like Israel, the Emiratis, the Saudis. They too view the JCPOA through a certain lens that going back to it somehow implies, A, that the administration will, much like Obama, will turn a blind eye to what concerns them, or the Iranians themselves, once the sanctions regime has been lifted, will lose much incentive to go ahead anytime soon and negotiate any real follow-on agreements or deal with regional questions. I think the last area that I would call a conflicting pressure or aim is, on the one hand, we want to preserve our leverage and show the cost to the Iranians of not changing their behavior. On the other hand, to achieve what we want, especially in the areas that go beyond extending the JCPOA, which the president-elect has talked about, or dealing with missiles or the region, we're going to have to provide the Iranians incentives. So reconciling that all creates, I think, a challenge for the administration. So where do you start in terms of trying to reconcile these conflicting pressures? I think you start obviously with consultations. I think there needs to be serious consultations with the Republicans on the Hill, key leaders. And here again, in the discussion, I want to cite an example from the Bush 41 administration that might be a kind of model for the Biden administration. But one, serious consultations with Republicans and leaders on the Hill, with the Europeans, because you want to have a common front towards the Iranians, and with the regional parties in a way that allows you to demonstrate to them that you've heard their concerns and you look for ways to take them into account. Now, it's possible that in these consultations, the Biden administration, the president, national security advisor, secretary of state, maybe they will be able to convince the Republicans and especially the regional actors that we know how to pursue this in a way that preserves our leverage, because that's the major, I think, issue aside from some of the symbolism that they'll need reassurance on. Maybe they'll succeed in that. I would hope that they will, but I've thought about an alternative approach that I think increases the prospects of reconciling this pressures. And that alternative approach is what I call a less for less arrangement. We need to understand to start with that compliance for compliance may sound simple, but we and the Iranians, I think, have very different definitions of what that means. For the president-elect, it means they come back into compliance first, and it will take them several months to be able to come back into compliance, just given how many areas where they're transgressing the limits, and some of the areas where they're transgressing that are not like a light switch that you can simply flip and you're back in compliance. So it'll take some time. The Iranian perspective is, no, the onus is on us to act first. We're the ones who walked away. We're the ones who impose these sanctions. They think they're due compensation, and in any case, they think they're entitled first to get sanctions relief before they have to complete the process of complying. So that by itself suggests to me this will not be a simple negotiation, although I'm the first to acknowledge there is no negotiation with the Iranians. It will be simple. But the alternative I'm suggesting is you might be able to do something more quickly and address a number of concerns of these different actors. A less for less arrangement would be one where we say, for example, the Iranians right now, the IAEA said they were up to 2,400 kilograms of low enriched uranium. At that time, about 10 times the amount that they're entitled to have in the JCPOA. Right now, it looks like they're up to over 2,600 kilograms. How about we have them, how about they go ahead and we suggest they cut that back to 1,000. They stop their enrichment of 20%. They dismantle 2 cascades of advanced centrifuges that they have installed. They weren't supposed to install those until 2025. And in return for that, we don't lift the sanctions regime, but we allow them access to some of their overseas accounts, all of which are frozen. By the way, they seem to be signaling the South Koreans, if you want your ship back, you have to give us access to the $7 billion we have of our money that's in your accounts. So they clearly want the kind of sanctions relief. Here we would give them that, but we're not, by not, in fact, giving up the sanctions regime, our sanctions regime, we can convey to the Republicans that we still have our leverage. Certainly the Republicans will find it easier to go along with an approach that isn't, quote, technically the JCPOA. And the regional actors might also be convinced that, okay, it's not the JCPOA, and this gives the Iranians a reason still to deal with these issues of concern. And as I said, for the Iranians, they do get some sanctions relief early. Now, is it a given this will happen and it can be worked out? No. As I said, no negotiations are easy with them. But this may be easier than the JCPOA. And in any case, its main benefit is that I think you have much more of a chance of getting Republican and regional support. And I think the Europeans are so anxious for us to resume diplomacy that they'll pretty much go along with something like this. There is a second idea I have, which does begin to get at the region, even though I said, you're not going to make what you do on the nuclear issue hostage to what happens in the region. But I do think it's important to do something in the region, partly again because of the signal it sends. But in my mind, I focus on what is also one area in the region where I see a very high potential for war breaking out. One of the things about arms control, and where I start off, I'm an old arms controller, is that arms control isn't about ending conflicts. It's about reducing the risk of the conflicts. It's about stabilizing them so that they're less likely to erupt. We have one area where Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran have a common interest, and that is not in having a war among them. All sorts of pressure against each other, but avoiding a war. Each of them knows that a war right now would be extremely costly. And it could be driven by one thing the Iranians are continuing to do. They're pushing a precision-guided project in Syria and Lebanon, meaning with a Hezbollah that has tens of thousands of rockets that are guided inertially, they don't have terminal guidance, they want to put terminal guidance on them. Israel won't live with that. Now there's an equation that has emerged where Israel hits targets related to the precision-guided project in Syria, but doesn't do it in Lebanon. Nasrallah of Hezbollah has established that you can hit targets in Syria and we won't retaliate, but you hit targets in Lebanon and we will. Now, Hezbollah doesn't want a war right now for all sorts of reasons, but not the least of which is they also know a real war with Israel could threaten Hezbollah itself. Israel will go after all the weapons depots, it'll go after the launch sites, it'll go after the leadership of Hezbollah. But it's not a low-cost enterprise for Israel. To root that out in Lebanon will be very costly. You have to go in on the ground. It involves a lot of urban fighting. It'll be very costly. In the meantime, the Lebanese, given the rockets they have, they can be hitting Israel with probably 2,000 rockets a day that could go on for at least 3 weeks to 4 weeks or even longer. So Israelis are going to be living in bomb shelters. And yet, at the same time, the Iranians can't just sit on the sidelines and assume they don't get touched. Israel won't allow a situation where they're being hit by 2,000 rockets a day and Iran is immune. So Israel will hit very high value targets within Iran. So here, it seems to me, is a logical area for a kind of arms control approach. Why the Iranians might go along with it is that it wouldn't deal with their actual presence in Syria or Lebanon. It would deal with what they're doing with regard to the precision guided project. And they could face much more pressure from the Russians and Chinese, who may want to limit American power everywhere, including in the Middle East, but don't want to be, in the Russian case, don't want to be caught in the middle of such a war. And in the Chinese case, don't want this kind of a destructive conflict. So this, I think, could also be a focus of some regional activity. Both the less for less and this limited arms control approach are designed to buy you time to launch into a negotiation that deals with what President-elect Biden has said he wants to do, deal with extending the JCPOA in terms of the sunset provisions, dealing with the other issues like ballistic missiles, but also regional sources of Iran's behavior that is destabilizing. You buy the time to deal with that. And obviously, if you ask the Iranians to give up more, they're going to ask us to provide more. It won't just be sanctions relief, it'll be economic benefits. We can get into why that's a complicated reality, in part because of Iran's banking system, among other factors, and the non-nuclear sanctions we have. But there are things that can be done that can provide the Iranians incentives, economic incentives, and show that there are benefits. And they include giving them access to dollar clearing operations so that they can engage much more effectively in trade, since so much of international trade is rooted in dollar currency. We could create special purpose vehicles, especially with the Europeans, not geared towards only humanitarian kinds of products and projects. We could create licenses for those based on an agreed set of criteria. We could provide technical assistance to their light industry. We could provide access for our consumer goods. There are a series of things that we could provide. And I would just sort of wrap up by saying, you still are going to have to preserve your leverage. And that's why I say you want to be effective on more for more, which you try to achieve over time. We also have to show the Iranians we're going to compete. We shouldn't walk away from emphasizing human rights issues. We should, in Iraq, make it clear we will support the Iraqi military and work with the Iraqi prime minister to expand the political space for the Iraqi government. We should be working with our regional partners to try to integrate their missile defenses, which could include the Israelis now, given the normalization that's taken place. We should be working to promote their ability to counter Iranian cruise missiles and drones. We should work with them also on contingency planning to deal with the Shia militias and the way they operate, and develop options there. And we should continue to push normalization as a way of changing the landscape in the region. My bottom line is, you start with a kind of less for less approach because it gives you a chance to create more buy-in from those who we've had problems with both domestically and in the region. You focus on limited arms control as a way of reducing the risk of an actual war. You use those to buy time to try to negotiate to achieve the larger purposes that the president-elect has outlined, but to do that, you're going to have to maintain your leverage. The more you show you're prepared to compete, the more you're going to find it easier to gain sustained Republican support, and I also think support from regional actors. So I'll stop there.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dennis. Again, everyone, if you do have questions, please feel free to send them to me directly at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org or use the Q&A function within the webinar. We'll now turn to our panelists. Meghan O'Sullivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you and Dennis for inviting me to join this event today. And it's also a pleasure to be on screen with Suzanne. I really thought this was an excellent paper with some real innovative thinking. It provides some really important insights into how rejoining the JCPOA or just dealing with the issue of Iran and the nuclear talks is much more complicated than I think has been appreciated, at least over the course of the campaign. Often we heard in the presidential campaign, we heard people talk about rejoining Paris and rejoining the JCPOA in the same basket as kind of two no-brainers, first out of the box type of things. But as Dennis's paper really lays out in his comments today, demonstrate this is going to be a very different kind of calculation than rejoining Paris and is going to be quite complicated in how it is done. The paper, as Dennis suggested just in his comments here, lays out some really useful lessons and examines assumptions, which I think is always a really appropriate starting place when looking at a strategy. And of the lessons, I think that is perhaps the most important that the paper makes clear is about the need for multiple tools in order for our strategy to be effective vis-a-vis Iran, and that we have decades of experience of US policy towards Iran that in some cases has been a strategy that has only employed sanctions as the entirety of the strategy. That's really never been successful. And in other cases where sanctions have been coupled with other tools to form a more wholesome strategy, and we've seen a lot more success there. And I think that is very important to highlight and certainly is reflective of looking at the Biden, looking at what Biden might do, but also looking at the Trump and the Obama administration policies. But the paper, I think, is most interesting in its proposals for how the Biden administration might move forward, what Dennis has referred to as less for less, or in the paper is referred to as an interim agreement, I think is really a very elegant way of managing an immediate problem, which is, what to do vis-a-vis Iran in the very small window that most people perceive we have for action, which is between the January 20th inauguration of President Biden and the June presidential elections in Iran. So it's a very short period. And the question is, what can be done in that period? And I think this idea of an interim agreement is definitely superior to where I think we are actually heading. And that is a strategy, or an approach rather, where the Biden administration would rejoin the JCPOA, largely on the back of the argument that it is important to do so in order to underscore or reestablish America's value as or credibility as a negotiating partner, or a partner in general, that this has to be done first and foremost, and only then after that credibility has been established or reestablished can the Biden administration negotiate additional follow-on agreements. So I think that, again, an interim agreement would be much preferable for this, because it would help us avoid, what I am thinking of in my mind, not less for less or more for more, but an approach of trying to get more with less, which is basically giving up a lot of the leverage that we have right now by rejoining the JCPOA, and then embarking on what could be an even harder challenge, which would be addressing ballistic missiles and regional activity of Iran with much less leverage. So I think that's the real appeal of what Dennis is offering, is it gives the Biden administration another approach, and one that might be able to preserve some of that leverage, which, as he mentioned, is the key issue. And I think the reasons are well laid out in Dennis's comments and the papers, but one that he mentioned and I would underscore is not only preserving leverage, but also to really take seriously this question of consultations with partners and allies, that is vital. There's a very different regional dynamic occurring than 2015. And as he mentioned, I think a lot of states, particularly in the Gulf, are really going to be looking at how the Biden administration handles the JCPOA as kind of a proxy for how it is going to handle relationships with the Gulf as a whole. So on the one hand, I see the real appeal of that, but I would also point out that the interim agreement doesn't necessarily resolve some of the really big questions. And I just mentioned two, and I think Dennis is well aware of them and has addressed them. You know, one is what are really the incentives that Iran has to go beyond the JCPOA as it now stands? And I would point out, and I'd welcome other people's views, but my assessment is we have less leverage than we had in 2015. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, I would say that China has stepped in, become much closer to Iran than it was in 2015, has thrown Iran a lifeline on a couple of occasions. This diminishes our leverage somewhat. And also, I put forward as a hypothesis that the Abraham Accords, for all their value, may have the unexpected effect of diminishing the credibility of force by Israel. Because although Israel and many of these Arab states have a lot in common with how they would like to approach Iran, I think that Arab states very much would like to avoid a war with Iran, and perhaps that would be, it would certainly at least make another set of important actors arguing against military force by Iran. The second big question, I think, that isn't resolved by an interim agreement or certainly rejoining the JCPOA quickly is how do these nuclear talks fit in the overall US strategy towards Iran? In the Obama administration, we often heard two really very different narratives. One was the narrative of this agreement will help Iran better integrate into the global community. This will help stoke more moderation inside Iran. This will lead to a moderation of Iran's behavior internationally and create the opportunity to build the bilateral and multilateral relationships. We heard that argument. And also at times we would hear the argument, well, we have under the JCPOA put the nuclear program in a box, and that gives us room to be more aggressive against other Iranian transgressions in the region and elsewhere. And neither of those really seem to prove true. And the question is, are either of these actually valid today? I would say we certainly know from past experience that the first one, I think you'd really have to be, I don't know what the right word is, but to believe that there's going to be moderation following a rejoining of the JCPOA, I think is not borne out by any facts. The second question is, does this actually create more scope for America to push back in other realms is also, I think, called into question, because one of the things we did learn from the JCPOA is how hard it was for the private sector to get the private sector to help deliver a lot of the benefits that Iran was expecting economically from the deal, because the private sector and international banks, even though it was legal for them to do business with Iran, they looked at the rest of the relationship with Iran and the United States in particular, and they did not want to take on that political risk. So I think, combining this being tough on Iran and sustaining the nuclear deal is going to continue to be a real challenge. So let me finish by just throwing out and being a little bit controversial. Another approach that could be considered, or at least is not given enough consideration, I would say, in the very short term, and that is the option of, in the very short term, in this window between the inauguration and the Iranian elections, doing nothing. Doing nothing is always a foreign policy choice. It's one that's often overlooked. And like I said, I think in this case, it certainly is. And what I mean by that is the Biden administration, upon coming into office, it could focus on the issues that it said it was going to focus on. COVID, economic recovery, China, these kinds of issues. And on the Iran file, it could just dial back its ambitions to change the landscape immediately in this short 4 to 5 month window. And instead, during that period, it could embark on these consultations that Dennis laid out as being so critical. It could engage in some more confidence building measures related to humanitarian assistance, to COVID help for Iran. It could say that it is interested in rejoining talks with Iran, but not fall over itself in order to make them happen, or to give concessions or make pledges that may not prove to be in the longer term interest of the United States. And the advantage of this would be that instead of scrambling to get something, the US could diminish the perception that it is over eager for an immediate deal with Iran. And Iran might actually think about its need to be more flexible if it is faced with the prospect of more time time under sanctions. I think it also helps the Biden administration avoid taking a first foreign policy step, which could by many be seen as odds with its other priorities. And I'm thinking about, one, being a priority of valuing partners and allies and consultations. 2, forging a bipartisan foreign policy agenda. 3, focusing on China. And even 4, this whole question of making climate change one of the top factors in the US foreign policy, because as we know, this dialogue with Iran is going to be very closely intertwined with energy and energy markets, and the oil market in particular. And, there'll be some people who say, how can you say your number one priority in foreign policy is climate change when your first action is doing something that brings a whole lot of oil onto the market and brings down the price of oil and makes it harder for other forms of energy to compete. Of course, there'd be downsides to the approach of doing nothing, which I think are fairly obvious and I'm happy to discuss. But again, I want to say how much I thought the paper had real value at this particular moment in time, and I hope it will get the attention it deserves by the incoming administration. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. So we've had less for less and do nothing. All right. Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Rob, and thanks to the Institute for bringing me together here today with Ambassador Ross and with Meghan. It's been a fantastic discussion so far, and I find myself in a nearly violent agreement with almost everything that's been said so far. And so I'll try to keep my remarks brief so that we can get to the discussion and questions from the audience. But I also wanted to commend the paper. If you haven't read it yet, please take the time to go beyond what Dennis has already explained. I think it's a fair and rich treatment of the challenge that we have before us with respect to Iran. And what I particularly value is the framing, the opening statement that the Middle East won't be a priority, and yet we simply can't put off the Iran issue. I think that that's a really important caveat, that we are in a different era with the inauguration of this new administration than we were back in 2009, when Dennis was tasked with putting forward an approach that might bring us to some kind of a successful negotiation with Iran, and eventually did pay off in the talks that led to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This administration, the Biden team, is going to be facing an entirely different context. And as Meghan has outlined, they've articulated priorities that make clear that while the Middle East is never far from the list of concerns in any White House, there are more urgent matters that are facing the president in his first days in office. And so I think we're going to have to be realistic about the amount of time and energy that certainly the players that were so involved in the last rounds of negotiations, many of whom are now back on the scene in even higher level positions than they were in the Obama administration, are going to be able to devote to the Iran issue during these early days. I think the other huge value of this paper is interrogating the assumptions that went into both the Trump and Obama approaches to Iran, to really think through the lessons learned from both experiences, because I think, every American president since Jimmy Carter has been confronted with the challenge of Iran and has struggled to devise a strategy that produces the ultimately successful results of meaningful change in the policies of greatest concern that Iran poses toward its neighbors, toward its population, and toward the world. And if we're not learning from the past, then we are, of course, doomed to repeat some of those mistakes. And so, I think a couple of them that I want to highlight and maybe foot stomp here that Meghan has already spoken to, this question of the utility of economic pressure. And Meghan, of course, is the author of one of the seminal books on the limitations of sanctions. We've seen both the limitations and, of course, as Dennis points out, the fact that our financial measures have a greater lifespan and a wider compliance, even where there's diplomatic opposition to implementing them. And these are unique and important insights. But what we know for a fact is that, it's not purely a matter of pressure. There has always been this sort of, I think, theory of the case with respect to Iran, that Iran does not respond to incentives, that Iran will moderate or comply if it's hit hard. And if you want them to do so, you have to hit them even harder. I think what we learned from the past 4 years is that hitting them harder and harder and harder is not simply a way to get either a moderation of the policies of concern, or for those who might have been aiming for this, some kind of regime change. Neither one of them came true. And in fact, as the paper makes clear, we are in a more dangerous position today with respect to the nuclear program, as well as, of course, Iran's regional activities than we were before the Trump administration took office. But it's also important, I think, especially because, there will be some sense of pride of authorship among all those who are part of the original nuclear negotiations, to really question and point out the misinterpretations and assumptions that underlay the Obama administration's approach. First and foremost is the sense of the segregation of the nuclear issue. And of course, that isn't unique to the Obama administration. It was the P5+1 was in fact the policy of initiated by the Bush administration that preceded it. Often doesn't get the credit for that successful mechanism. And so it had been a long-standing and really bipartisan presumption that the nuclear issue topped all others with respect to its urgency and required a singular approach. But I think that what we have all taken away from this experience is that even the most robust nuclear deal, even if we had seen a full ban on enrichment and other measures that some of the critics would have liked to see in the JCPOA, it would not have withstood the pressures that would have been created by Iran's other problematic activities, particularly its expansion around the region. And so we have to be able to create an approach to Iran which is not self-limiting in the sense of trying to do everything all at once, but is also not isolating a single issue without putting similar effort and attention to the other set of concerns that we have with respect to Iran. I think the other important issue, assumption underlying the Obama approach that Dennis takes a good point with, is this idea that somehow engagement with Iran, that the success on the nuclear issue was going to lead to a modulation of Iran's other activities of concern. And Meghan put it really very eloquently in her remarks that anyone who still believes that might be possible really hasn't been paying close attention to what's happening around the region. The idea that goodwill can create goodwill, unfortunately, is not conceivable with a regime that is predicated its founding ideology on anti-Americanism. This is not a leadership that wants rapprochement. That's never been in the cards. And so if we're going to try to devise an approach that is going to be successful beyond, not just on the nuclear issue, but beyond, we have to be able to replicate some of what enabled the nuclear diplomacy to work, particularly the multilateralism and the support from partners and allies, to bring to bear to some of the other sets of policies that Iran pursues. Final point around these kinds of assumptions that I think is also important is, this idea about goodwill and the idea of engagement creating space for other kinds of diplomatic successes, I think relates to a presumption on the part of many within the Obama administration and many around Washington that somehow there are hidden moderates within Iran. And if only we can find them and quote unquote empower them, that we can somehow change the calculus of this regime. Again, I think that is a profound misinterpretation. And I think that what we're going to have to do is to try to stop fetishizing the idea of Iranian domestic politics. There are real divisions within the power structure within Iran, but ultimately the supreme leader makes all the decisions. He endorsed the nuclear deal in 2015. Any kind of diplomacy that moves forward under the Biden administration will only happen on the terms that the supreme leader sets. Let's be very clear about that and clear-eyed and try to bring around particularly our European allies to understand much of the same. So I think the primary takeaways from the paper about not rushing into the JCPOA purely for the sake of the symbolism that is undertaken over the course of the past 4 years. As Meghan said, along with Paris, it has been really the kind of a touch point for critics of the Trump administration's policy toward the region and the world, and a symbol of the utility of multilateral diplomacy. We don't want the JCPOA purely as a symbol. Our goal here has to be around deterring Iran's progress toward a nuclear weapon and creating the framework for policies that will improve and moderate Iran's approach to the region and its treatment of its own population. And so in that sense, I want to also just close with one other important takeaway, I think, as we are only just a few weeks away from this administration, is that we should not, as Meghan said, be beholden to a particular timeline. I would not hold the Iranian presidential election as a serious constraint or a serious reason for urgency on our side. I think the Iranians, as Dennis well put it, are trying to impose some urgency on the situation, essentially by provoking a crisis. It's a very North Korea style approach to January, and they may well succeed. But the Biden administration should resist the temptation to be drawn into crisis diplomacy with the Iranians. What we need to be doing now is trying to frame a process that moves this issue off of the list of urgent concerns for the new president, that enables the team to tackle their real priorities around China, around pandemic control and economic rehabilitation in the wake of the pandemic, and creates the kind of normalized diplomacy that we ought to have with Iran, simply because it is such an important player across the region. Creates space and time for working through a process that brings us back to a situation where we're no longer facing a short breakout time on the Iranian nuclear program, but also does give us the capacity to springboard to other negotiations around the longer and stronger deal that I think everyone in Washington now agrees is necessary, as well as around the other issues of concern. It's why I'm so excited by the team that we are seeing assembled by the Biden administration, the most experienced team when it comes to dealing with Iran since the pre-revolutionary period, and particularly by the news that Brett McGurk may be taking on a role back in the White House. Brett was, of course, crucial to the negotiation that led to the release of a number of Americans who are held in American prisons. And I think this is one of the important issues that Dennis refers to in the paper, the fact that we see the Iranians continuing to abuse their own population, as well as dual nationals who are traveling there, using them as well as now South Korean tanker ships as hostages, really to try to get their way. We need to fashion a strategy that is capable of dealing with that kind of a rogue regime and capable of ensuring that we are not treating the JCPOA as a good simply in and of itself. With that, look forward to the conversation, and thanks for having me today.
Very good. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Fascinating remarks. Each of you offered sort of nuanced suggestions, but there is a common denominator, which is slow down. Take your time. The JCPOA, I'm hearing all three of you say, is not some holy sacred document that needs to be re-entered into on day one of a new administration. Let's view our entire Iran portfolio of challenges. Let's take our time. Dennis offers a less for less suggestion. Each of you offered different types of diplomatic paths, but the commonality here of taking time, I thought was quite striking. We do have a number of questions that have come in, both in the Q&A function and directly to email to me. Let me ask a few of them. Let me start with a question from Ambassador Stephen Mull, who had important responsibility for JCPOA implementation in the second Obama administration. Let me read this question. Thanks for a thoughtful, important paper and presentation. One thing that Foreign Minister Zarif loved to stress was that the Iranians have difficult internal politics too. I think this is to you, Dennis. What do you expect the likely impact of a less for less nuclear arrangement would be on the Iranian presidential elections that you mentioned in your remarks?
Well, I think Suzanne should also comment on this. But I take a kind of a page from Suzanne on this. I think we can overthink how much we can influence what the Iranian elite politics are. In many respects, they have their own dynamic. I'm not saying our behaviors don't have any effect, but to think that we can somehow choreograph a series of steps that are going to produce a certain outcome, I think is a mistake. We don't have the kind of handle on it that would allow us to do that. So much of what we do know, I think, is also designed for us to know, meaning to play us. And I would just say, a less for less deal, does it reflect what the Iranians want? No, the Iranians want back into the JCPOA, but they want back in on their terms. They want back in where we provide compensation. We lift sanctions first, or at least we give them sanctions relief first. And by the way, they have changed the ground rules in terms of their knowledge base, especially with the operation of 2 cascades of advanced centrifuges. So I have no doubt their preference is to be back into the JCPOA and everything it means in terms of us lifting all the sanctions. I don't think in the end, I'm not going to exaggerate, I think, the role this is going to play in the heart of the Iranian election. And if there's a less for less, I think in the end, the Iranians will go along with it because they clearly want sanctions relief. And we need to balance this in a way where whatever sanctions relief they get doesn't minimize the kind of leverage we continue to have. I think one of the big fears of the regional states in particular, we do the JCPOA, then why do the Iranians, and I think, Meghan, I think you may have raised this, why do the Iranians even have an interest in doing anything beyond that? Yeah, maybe they want to get more economic benefits, but at that point, my guess is they're quite content to play for time. So I wouldn't exaggerate the impact of less for less has on their presidential election.
Meghan, do you want to add on this?
Very briefly, I agree completely with Suzanne and Dennis about we shouldn't be gaming these domestic politics. But one thing I think we can probably say with some confidence is if we're looking at the June election and what we might do and how that could have an impact is if we do ask, as the incoming Biden team seems to be hoping for, if we do ask the Iranians to reverse everything that they've done in violation of the agreement before we rejoin the agreement. That will be very hard to do in the run up to a presidential election, is, for Iran to make the first move. I think that I'd almost rule that out entirely, but, with the caveat that we never exactly can game out those dynamics.
Okay, a question for all of you. Our conversation talks about U.S. policy and the allies, both in Europe and in the Middle East. But there are at least 2 other actors in the original negotiations: Russia and China. Alexander Vershbow, the former ambassador to Russia, sends in a question. Biden has promised a tough line toward Russia, but has said he wants to negotiate with Moscow on arms control. Do the speakers think Russia would exert any real leverage to persuade Iran to agree to, let's say, an interim agreement that Dennis proposes? Will Putin play the spoiler? And I want to expand this to China as well. What can we expect from Russia and China on the Iran issue, and in the context of this new administration's approach to dealing with Russia and China? Suzanne, should I first start with you?
I'm happy to start, but I know Ambassador Ross has a great depth of knowledge on Russia, so I want to be brief here. Look, they are both important players, but we saw over the course of the long, hard diplomacy that led to the JCPOA that we can, in fact, work with Russia in particular around Iran, even at moments of considerable bilateral friction. And part of this is simply because we do have a common interest in trying to avert progress toward nuclear weapons capability on the part of the Iranians. The Russians don't want to see that any more than anybody else does. And they were, in fact, I think, useful players for much of the diplomacy that led to the JCPOA. Meghan pointed out the expanded role for the Chinese at this point, certainly expanded in terms of their economic role with respect to Iran. But it's not clear to me that they're prepared to either play, kind of a spoiler or to any kind of American-led diplomacy, particularly if that were to have traction with the other parties to the deal. I think the Chinese are likely to get with whatever program we might be able to fashion. So I don't see either one of them providing a kind of problem to getting back to diplomacy or subverting any kind of diplomacy if it were meaningful and designed to produce the result that we saw in 2015 or something along those same lines.
Thank you. Meghan, do you have a comment on Russia or China?
Just very briefly, so we can hear from Dennis. I would say, I largely agree with Suzanne. I do think we haven't given enough attention, given limited time to the change dynamics in the region from the 2015 period, and that what seems to be stronger than that period is, the potential for an Iran, Russia, Turkey cooperation, and that perhaps the Russians are going to be less interested in being helpful. I agree with her on China. China has obviously helped out Iran, but that China will look at Iran, I believe, more in the context of its relationship with the United States, and that is going to be much more important to China than its relationship to Iran going forward.
Okay, thank you. Dennis?
Look, I very much agree with what both Suzanne and Meghan have said. I guess I would just add maybe 2 points. One is that from the American perspective, from the Biden administration perspective, he's made it very clear we will compete with the Russians and with the Chinese for that matter. But also there are areas where we have overlapping interests, and where those interests converge, we're going to cooperate. I think in the case of Iran, the Russians, the Chinese, and we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. I think in the case of the Russians and the Chinese in particular don't want a wide war in the region. I can make a variety of different arguments about where the Russians might be on this, but what is fundamental is they don't want to be in the middle of it. That's for sure. Now, it is true, I think what Meghan was just raising, there is, I think, on the Russian side, a lot of focus right now on how they kind of manipulate what their presence is going to be. They're in Syria, they're in Libya, they're competing with Turkey. Turkey is actually, ironically, sending certain signals now about how it wants to improve its relations with Israel. I actually think that's a message to the incoming Biden administration about wanting to mend certain fences with us, as it also has to think about its own competition with the Russians. So there's kind of a kaleidoscope here, and you have to sort of weigh what the interests are on any particular issue. One thing we know about Putin, he's going to pursue what he thinks serves Russia's interest, one, and they'll be narrowly defined. Two, he wants to see a diminution of American presence and influence in the region. He would like to see, he'd like to drive us out of the small presence we still have in Syria. He has that in common with the Iranians. So there are areas where we're going to compete with the Russians there, but there's also areas where there's a commonality. And Putin obviously still has issues outside of the region that are important. He would like to see sanctions lifted as it relates to their behavior on Ukraine. So there's like with many of these issues, there are multiple intersection points on different questions, and you almost have to sort of go through and weigh each of them and then think about where is the one point of commonality? And I think there are some points of commonality, and that's why I also don't see the Chinese trying to play a spoiler role. Ironically, they probably think an American presence in the region helps to preserve the kind of stability they have an interest in. So this is not all so clear cut.
All right, let me take just one more question, so I want to be mindful of the time. Last question is really a sort of collection of possible issues. It all boils down to this. We're all focused on Iran nuclear diplomacy, but of course the Iranians may have their own agenda, and they may want to test America somewhere else. We're already seeing this, as you mentioned earlier, with the South Korean tanker. There may be a test against the American embassy in Baghdad. There may be another Aramco test. There may be something in Syria. There may be Hezbollah. There's lots of ways the Iranians can test the new administration. Without going into all the different permutations, what sort of lesson, what sort of message would you hope that test episode ends with from the new administration to Iran? How should it end so that it leaves the potential for diplomacy, the potential for a successful re-engagement with Iran in a better situation? Dennis, we'll start with you, and then any comments from our panelists?
I think the Iranians always have to understand they have a lot to lose when they test us. if they test us and feel that we are too quick to respond or too quick to concede, it's going to reinforce an instinct they have anyway to do more of that. So I think on the one hand, they should see they have a lot to lose by testing us, but they should also see that if they behave in a different way, that diplomacy with us can ultimately lead to some benefits for them.
Okay, thank you. Meghan, Suzanne, final remarks?
I would say not predicting exactly what the test would be, but a good outcome of the test would be if there was a clear alignment of the US and Europe and others vis-a-vis Iran. And I think the reason I say that is I think in some channels there may be the perception that the rest of the world is looking at the US as the problem child and as the one that withdrew from the JCPOA, which is true, and so the one that needs to make amends. And I think there are some Iranian activities that are of great concern, not just to Americans, but to others. And a test scenario that didn't lead to war, but that led to a clarifying moment that actually the US is pretty much aligned with the rest of the world against some of these activities against Iran, I think would be a good outcome and would be helpful in further negotiations.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Suzanne, the last word?
More agreement from my side. I would just point out that one of the lessons that ought to be learned by the new administration from the experience under the Trump administration, that we can hit back against Iran in ways that are kinetic as well as economic, and not necessarily receive the kind of blowback that many presumed would be catastrophic. I'm not suggesting we ought to be in the practice of trying to assassinate Iranian Quds Force leaders, but we do know that we don't need to sit on our hands when we see the Iranians up to bad behavior. And I hope that this administration takes that to heart.
Very good. Well, I want to thank all three of you, Dennis, Meghan, and Suzanne. I urge everyone to go to the website of the Washington Institute to take a close look and read Dennis's new Transition 2021 paper on Iran nuclear diplomacy. I'm grateful for the participation of everybody in today's event. We try to be mindful of everyone's time, and so I think this was a fascinating hour of discussion. I want to thank you all and wish you all a good rest of the afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne.